Is Africa really more homophobic than the West? There is a sentence that has become almost reflexive in global conversations about sexuality. Africa is more homophobic than the West. It is repeated with confidence, often without malice, and usually without much pause. It appears in news reports, online debates, documentaries, and even well-intentioned advocacy spaces. Over time, it has begun to feel less like a question and more like a conclusion, something assumed rather than examined. But conclusions reached too quickly tend to hide more than they reveal. Because when we talk about Africa, we are not talking about a single place or a single way of thinking. We are talking about an entire continent made up of dozens of countries, thousands of cultures, and an extraordinary range of social norms, belief systems, histories, and lived realities. And when we talk about the West, we are referring to societies that are themselves still negotiating what acceptance looks like, often unevenly and sometimes painfully. So before deciding where homophobia exists more, it is worth slowing the conversation down. What does homophobia actually look like in daily life? How is it experienced, rather than reported? And whose definitions are we using when we try to measure it? In much of the United States and Europe, progress is often understood through visibility. Public pride celebrations, rainbow flags on storefronts, openly queer celebrities, and legal recognition are treated as milestones that signal social advancement. These markers are meaningful, they offer affirmation, they create representation. And for many people, they provide a sense of safety that did not exist before. But visibility can also create an illusion of completion. Even in countries with legal protections, queer people still face family rejection, workplace discrimination, religious exclusion, and social isolation. Many live with quiet compromises, out in some spaces, guarded in others. For some, safety depends on silence. For others, visibility brings new risks rather than relief. The presence of rights on paper does not always translate into ease of life. This complexity is often acknowledged when discussing Western societies. Progress is described as ongoing, imperfect, and contested. But when conversations turn to Africa, that same nuance frequently disappears. Instead, Africa is often portrayed through a narrow lens, shaped by moments of crisis. Media attention tends to arrive during arrests, protests, or legal debates, then quickly move on. Rarely do these stories linger long enough to show daily life, interpersonal relationships, or the quieter ways people build meaning and belonging. The result is a powerful, but incomplete image, one that suggests queerness exists in Africa only as conflict, rather than as community. Yet queerness does not vanish simply because it does not announce itself loudly. In many African societies, identity is not primarily organized around individual self-definition. Life is often structured through family, community, spirituality, and shared responsibility. Within these frameworks, queerness may exist relationally rather than declaratively. It may be understood through behavior, care, and mutual recognition rather than through labels. Love can exist without being named. Partnership can exist without public declaration. Desire can exist without being framed as identity. To observers accustomed to Western expressions of queerness, this can look like absence. But absence is not the same as invisibility, and invisibility is not the same as non-existence. Across the continent, queer Africans are making thoughtful, deliberate choices about how they live. Some are openly expressive. Others are quietly self-assured. Many move fluidly between visibility and privacy depending on context. These choices are not signs of denial. They are reflections of social awareness, familial bonds, personal safety, and long-term well-being. And once again, this is not unique to Africa. In the West, countless queer people also navigate layered visibility. They may be out to friends but not family, open at work but cautious in public, expressive online but reserved offline. The difference is not that one group has complexity and the other does not, but that complexity is interpreted differently, depending on cultural expectations. Another factor shaping perception is how acceptance is measured. Global comparisons often rely on laws, surveys, or opinion polls. These tools are useful or limited. Laws can exist without enforcement. Tolerance can exist without warmth. Public approval can coexist with private rejection. Numbers rarely capture the emotional texture of daily life. In the United States, legal recognition has expanded dramatically over the past decades. Yet queer youth remain disproportionately affected by homelessness. Transgender people continue to face uncertainty around healthcare and public participation. Acceptance exists, but it is uneven, fragile, and often conditional. So when comparisons are made between regions, they must be made with care. Otherwise, they risk confusing legal frameworks with lived experience. Storytelling also plays a powerful role. Stories about Western queer life are often told from within the community itself, allowing for contradiction, debate, humor, critique, and growth. Stories about Africa, however, are frequently told from the outside, condensed into summaries that prioritize urgency over understanding. When challenges arise in Western societies, they are often framed as moments within a broader trajectory of change. When similar challenges appear in African contexts, they are more likely to be framed as reflections of culture as a whole. This difference matters because it shapes how audiences interpret responsibility, possibility, and humanity. Culture everywhere is dynamic. It shifts through conversation, generational change, art, faith, and everyday negotiation. Across Africa, people are already engaging these questions, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately, sometimes in ways that do not fit neatly into international narratives. Queer Africans are writing, designing, performing, teaching, building businesses, forming families, caring for elders, and imagining futures rooted in dignity. Some do so visibly, others do so quietly. Many do both, at different points in their lives. The idea that queerness must look the same everywhere, in order to be real, is a narrow one. It reflects a specific cultural framework, rather than a universal truth. Which brings us back to the original question. Is Africa really more homophobic than the West? The question itself assumes that homophobia is something that can be ranked like a scorecard. It assumes that progress moves in a straight line, and that one part of the world can stand comfortably at the finish line, while others lag behind. But human experience does not move in straight lines. Every society is negotiating questions of identity, belonging, tradition, and change. Some do so through loud public debate, others through quiet adaptation. Some through laws and courtrooms, others through living rooms, places of worship, and conversations that never reach an audience. If we want a more honest understanding of queerness globally, we must move beyond comparisons that flatten complexity. We must learn to recognize presence, even when it is not packaged for visibility. And we must allow people to define their lives on their own terms. Queerness is not owned by any region. It is not limited by geography. And it does not require validation to exist. Perhaps the more meaningful question is not whether Africa is more homophobic than the West, but whether we are willing to listen closely enough to hear queer lives where we are not used to seeing them. Because when we do, a fuller story emerges, one that is not about absence, but endurance, not about comparison, but humanity, and not about who is ahead, but about how people live, love, and survive, everywhere, in ways that prioritize survival, continuity, and care. The task is not to make silence speak in someone else's voice. It is to recognize that silence has always been speaking on its own terms. And when we learn to hear it, the story changes.